The early morning sun was just beginning to peek through the trees as Staff Sergeant James Cooper parked his old blue Toyota truck in the empty lot of Silver Falls State Park. It was 6:30 a.m., and the park had only opened 30 minutes ago. He liked coming this early because there were no crowds, no noise, and no one to disturb his peace. James was different from many soldiers who came back from war. At 32 years old, he didn't drink, didn't smoke, and spent most of his time alone. His therapist said this wasn't healthy, but she also told him to find a quiet place where he could think and heal. That's why he chose this waterfall. The sound of falling water helped him forget the sounds of war that still echoed in his mind. As he stepped out of his truck, James adjusted his plain black t-shirt and comfortable cargo pants. Even though he wasn't in uniform anymore, old habits died hard. His clothes were neat, his boots were clean, and his short military haircut was as precise as ever. Some soldiers let themselves go after leaving the service, but James believed that discipline was more important now than ever. The morning air was cool and damp as he walked down the trail to the waterfall. The path was well maintained, with wooden railings and clear signs pointing the way. James had memorized every turn and step during his daily visits over the past 3 weeks. His combat-trained eyes automatically scanned the surroundings, noting the movement of branches in the light breeze and the occasional scurrying of small animals. When he reached the main viewing area, James smiled slightly at the sight of Silver Falls. The massive waterfall dropped 177 feet from the cliffs above, creating a constant mist that made rainbows in the morning sunlight. The sound was perfect, loud enough to drown out unwanted thoughts but peaceful enough to calm his mind. James found his usual spot, a flat rock slightly away from the main viewing platform. He sat down cross-legged, keeping his back straight just as his meditation instructor had taught him. It wasn't easy for a soldier to learn meditation, but after 3 tours in Afghanistan and losing too many friends, he knew he needed help dealing with his memories. As he settled in, James thought about his last tour. He had been the leader of a special forces team, responsible for 12 men in some of the most dangerous parts of the country. They had completed every mission successfully, but success in war came with a price. The face of young Private Martinez sometimes appeared in his dreams, along with the sounds of that terrible day when they lost him. The cool mist from the waterfall touched his face, bringing him back to the present. This was why he came here, to practice staying in the now, as his therapist called it. James took deep breaths, counting them like he had been taught. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 7, out through the mouth for 8. The technique was simple, but it worked. A few early morning birds started their songs, adding to the peaceful atmosphere. In the distance, James could see a deer and its fawn carefully making their way to the water's edge. He stayed perfectly still, not wanting to disturb them. This was what he needed, this quiet, this connection with nature, this moment of peace. The rising sun slowly filled the canyon with golden light, making the waterfall sparkle like it was full of diamonds. James checked his watch. He had been here for almost an hour, and soon the first tourists would start arriving. Usually, he would leave before the crowds came, but today felt different. He decided to stay a little longer, feeling more relaxed than he had in weeks. James reached into his small backpack and pulled out a bottle of water and a protein bar. As he ate his simple breakfast, he watched 2 squirrels chasing each other around a nearby tree. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to happiness. The war seemed far away, and the peaceful scene before him felt like it could heal even the deepest wounds. Little did he know that this peaceful morning was about to change dramatically. The sound he would hear next would shatter this tranquil scene and bring him face to face with a different kind of battle, one he never expected to fight at this beautiful waterfall. The peaceful morning shattered like glass when the first motorcycle roared into the parking lot. James's body tensed automatically at the sound, his years of military training kicking in before his mind could even process what was happening. The harsh growl of engines echoed off the canyon walls, drowning out the gentle sound of the waterfall. 5 motorcycles, all black and chrome, thundered into the parking area. Their riders were dressed in dirty leather jackets with patches showing a dead raven on them. The leader's bike was bigger than the others, with flame designs painted on its fuel tank. Even from a distance, James could smell the alcohol on them. They had clearly been drinking all night. The group's leader, a huge man with tattoos covering his neck and arms, stepped off his bike first. His friends called him Razor, probably because of the razor blade tattoo on his throat. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall and looked like he weighed close to 300 pounds. The other four bikers were smaller but looked just as mean, with long dirty beards and eyes that seemed to be looking for trouble. Two families who had just arrived at the park quickly gathered their children and hurried back to their cars. An elderly couple who had been taking pictures of the waterfall also left quickly, the old man protectively putting his arm around his wife's shoulders as they walked away. James watched all this while staying perfectly still on his rock, his military training telling him to observe and assess before taking any action. "Hey, look what we got here," Razor shouted, pointing at James. His voice was rough and mean. "Looks like a Boy Scout having his morning meditation." The other bikers laughed loudly, and one of them took a beer can out of his jacket pocket. James didn't move or respond. He kept his breathing steady, just like he had learned in Special Forces training. Always let the enemy make the first move. Always know what you're dealing with before you act. He counted the weapons he could see. 2 chain belts, what looked like brass knuckles on one guy, and probably knives hidden somewhere. These weren't amateur thugs. The bikers spread out around the viewing area, acting like they owned it. One of them, a skinny guy with a red bandana, started throwing empty beer cans into the protected water area below the falls. Another one took out a knife and began carving his name into the wooden information board that told visitors about the waterfall's history. "Hey, military boy," Razor shouted again, walking closer to James. "Don't you know it's polite to say hello when someone talks to you?" He kicked some dirt toward James's spot, trying to provoke a reaction. Just then, an elderly park volunteer in a green vest came walking up the trail. He was carrying a trash pickup stick and a garbage bag, doing his morning clean-up routine. When he saw the mess the bikers were making, he bravely spoke up. "Excuse me, gentlemen," the old volunteer said, his voice shaking a little but still firm. "This is a protected natural area. Please don't throw trash in the water or damage the signs. There are garbage cans by the parking lot." Razor turned toward the old man, his face twisting into an ugly smile. Well, looks like we got ourselves a real park ranger here, boys." The other bikers stopped what they were doing and moved closer, surrounding the volunteer. James watched as the old man's face went pale, but the volunteer stood his ground. "Please," the volunteer said again, "this is a beautiful place. Let's keep it that way for everyone to enjoy." "Oh, we'll enjoy it all right," Razor growled, taking a step toward the volunteer. "We'll enjoy it any way we want to." He reached out and grabbed the front of the old man's vest. That was the moment James decided to act. He had seen enough. These men weren't just being rowdy, they were dangerous, and they were about to hurt an innocent person. As he smoothly rose to his feet, James felt the familiar calm that always came before combat. His mind was clear, his body ready, and his training was about to be put to use in a way he never expected at this peaceful waterfall. James moved with quiet confidence, his boots making no sound on the stone path as he approached the group. Years of combat training had taught him how to move silently, even on rough ground. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides, but every muscle in his body was ready to react. "Let him go," James said calmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the authority of someone used to giving commands in battle. The bikers all turned to look at him, surprised by his sudden appearance behind them. Razor still held the old volunteer's vest, but his attention was now fully on James. "Well, look who decided to join the party," he sneered. The Boy Scout finally found his voice. The elderly volunteer was trembling slightly, but his eyes showed relief when he saw James standing there. James took another step forward, positioning himself carefully. He could see all 5 bikers at once now, just like he had been trained to do in close combat situations. "I said, let him go," James repeated, still keeping his voice steady. "He's just doing his job. There's no need for trouble here." Razor laughed, but he did release the volunteer's vest with a rough push. The old man stumbled backward but managed to keep his balance. James nodded slightly toward the trail, and the volunteer understood, quickly moving away from the group. "You know what I think?" Razor said, taking a heavy step toward James. "I think you military types are all the same. You come back here thinking you're some kind of heroes, but you're nothing without your guns and your tanks." The other bikers spread out in a half circle, trying to surround James. He noticed everything. The way they moved, who seemed most nervous, who was likely to attack first. The one with the red bandana kept touching his back pocket, probably where he had a knife hidden. "This is a peaceful place," James said. People come here with their families, with their children. There are plenty of other places you can go to drink and have fun. Oh, you hear that, boys? Razor mocked, looking at his friends. The soldier boy is giving us a lecture about where we can and can't have fun. The others laughed, but James noticed their laughter seemed forced. They were watching him carefully, sensing something about him was different. One of the bikers, probably the youngest of the group, spat on the ground near James's boots. "My brother was in the army," he said with hate in his voice. "Came back all messed up in the head. You people think you're better than everyone else." James kept his eyes moving between all of them, noting every shift in position, every twitch of their hands. He knew what was coming. He had seen this kind of situation build up many times before, both in war and in peace. "Your brother served his country," James said to the young biker. "That's something to be proud of, not angry about." "Shut up," the young biker shouted, his face turning red. "You don't know anything about my brother." He started to move forward, but Razor held up his hand, stopping him. No, let's handle this properly," Razor said with an ugly smile. He cracked his knuckles loudly. "Mr. Military Man wants to teach us about respect. Maybe we should teach him something instead." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. James could hear the waterfall behind them, its peaceful sound now a strange backdrop to the violence that was about to explode. Two of the bikers had already pulled out their chains, letting them dangle from their fists. "Last chance," James said quietly. "Walk away now, and we can all forget this happened." Razor's response was a deep, angry laugh. "You hear this guy? He's giving you us a last chance." He took another step closer to James, towering over him. "No, soldier boy, we're giving you a last chance. Get on your knees and apologize, or we're going to show you what real fighting is about." James took a slow, deep breath. He had tried to avoid this, just like his therapist had taught him, but some situations couldn't be talked away. As Razor pulled back his fist for the first punch, James's mind shifted into combat mode, everything around him becoming crystal clear. The peaceful morning was over. Now it was time to remember other lessons learned in far more dangerous places than this. Razor's first punch was exactly what James expected. A wide, powerful swing fueled by anger and beer. In the split second before it connected, time seemed to slow down for James, just like it used to during combat operations. His special forces training took over, his body moving without conscious thought. James stepped smoothly to the side, letting Razor's fist sweep through empty air. The big man's momentum carried him forward, throwing him off balance. Before anyone could blink, James grabbed Razor's extended arm and used the biker's own weight against him, redirecting his forward motion. Razor found himself stumbling past James, nearly falling face first into a wooden railing. "Get him!" Razor shouted, his face red with rage and embarrassment. The biker with the red bandana moved first, pulling the knife from his back pocket just as James had predicted. The blade gleamed in the morning sunlight. "Bad choice," James said quietly. As the knife wielder lunged forward, James's hand shot out with snake-like speed, catching the man's wrist. His thumb pressed into a precise point that made the biker's fingers open automatically, dropping the knife. In the same fluid motion, James twisted the man's arm behind his back, using just enough pressure to control him without causing serious injury. The young biker who had talked about his brother came next, swinging a heavy chain. James pushed his captive toward the chain wielder, causing both men to stumble into each other. They fell in a tangle of limbs and purses, the chain clattering uselessly on the ground. "Stop right there," the fourth biker shouted, pulling brass knuckles from his pocket. He was shorter than the others but muscular, with a wild look in his eyes. "I was a boxer before I joined the Ravens." James remained perfectly calm, his breathing steady and controlled. He could see the boxer had some training. His stance was proper, and he held his hands correctly. But James had trained with professional fighters from 3 different military branches, and he could spot the man's weaknesses immediately. The boxer threw a quick combination: jab, cross, hook, but his movements were slowed by alcohol and anger. James blocked the first 2 punches and ducked under the third, moving closer to the biker. Before the man could react, James swept his front leg while simultaneously pushing his shoulder, using a basic military takedown technique. The boxer hit the ground hard, his brass knuckles flying from his grip. The 5th biker, who had been hanging back, suddenly rushed forward with another chain. But he was nervous, and his attack was clumsy. James caught the chain as it swung toward him, wrapping it around his forearm just like he'd been taught in close quarters combat training. With a sharp pull, he yanked the biker off balance and sent him sprawling. Razor had recovered by now and was charging back like an angry bull. "I'm going to kill you," he roared, reaching for James's throat with his huge hands. But James was ready. He shifted his weight slightly, turning his body at the perfect angle. As Razor's hands were about to grab him, James executed a perfect hip throw, a basic move he had practiced thousands of times in training. Razor's feet left the ground, and for a brief moment, the huge biker was airborne. Then he crashed down hard on his back, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. In less than 30 seconds, all 5 bikers were on the ground, groaning and cursing. James hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't needed to. Every move he used was defensive, designed to neutralize threats without causing serious injury. "Stay down," James advised them calmly. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will if you make me." From the trail came the sound of running feet and voices. The elderly volunteer had returned with 2 park rangers, who stopped in shock at the scene before them. 5 tough-looking bikers were scattered on the ground, while a single man in a black t-shirt stood calmly in the middle of them all. James knew this fight wasn't over yet. Razor was already struggling to get up, his face twisted with hatred and humiliation. The other bikers were also moving, their pride hurt more than their bodies. The real test was about to begin, and James could only hope he could end this without anyone getting seriously injured. The 2 park rangers moved cautiously forward, their hands on their radios. They were young and looked nervous. This wasn't the kind of situation they usually dealt with at Silver Falls. Before they could reach the scene, Razor had pushed himself up to his feet, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't your business anymore, soldier boy," Razor growled, pulling something from his boot. The morning sun glinted off a switchblade. "Now it's personal." James noticed the rangers freeze in their tracks at the sight of the weapon. He understood their hesitation. They weren't trained for this kind of confrontation. "Stay back," he called to them calmly, "and call for backup." The other bikers were getting up too, forming a tighter circle around James. The one with the red bandana had retrieved his knife, and the boxer had found his brass knuckles. The young biker who talked about his brother now held a broken piece of wooden railing like a club. "You made us look bad," Razor said, moving the switchblade in slow circles. "Nobody makes the dead ravens look bad." James's mind flashed back to a night in Afghanistan when his team had been surrounded by armed insurgents. The situation had been different, but the feeling was the same: multiple threats, all angles covered, weapons in play. He had gotten his men out of that situation, and he would get out of this one too. "Last warning," James said, his voice carrying the authority of combat experience. "Drop the weapons. The Rangers have already called this in. Police will be here soon." Razor answered with action instead of words, lunging forward with his switchblade. But James had been trained by the best knife fighters in the military, including experts from the Israeli Defense Forces. He saw the attack coming before it began, reading it in Razor's shoulder movement. James stepped inside the blade's arc, grabbing Razor's knife hand with both of his own. His thumbs pressed precise pressure points while his fingers locked around the biker's wrist. There was a sharp crack as the switchblade fell from Razor's suddenly numb fingers. The boxer came in from the left, brass knuckles flashing. James used Razor's body as a shield, spinning the larger man into the boxer's path. The 2 collided hard, but James wasn't done. He pushed both men toward the biker with the wooden railing, causing all 3 to stumble. Red Bandana slashed with his knife, but James had already moved. He caught the biker's arm, turned his hip, and executed a perfect shoulder throw. Red Bandana flew through the air and landed hard on his back, the knife skittering away across the ground. The 5th biker tried to run forward and grab James from behind, but this was a mistake. James dropped his shoulder and used the man's own momentum to flip him over. The biker crashed onto the hard ground, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Razor had managed to untangle himself from the others and was coming back, this time with a heavy chain wrapped around his fist. His face was a mask of pure rage as he swung the makeshift weapon at James's head. James ducked under the chain and stepped closer to Razor, inside his guard. His hands moved in precise strikes, hitting nerve clusters in Razor's shoulder and elbow. The big man's arm went limp, the chain falling useless to the ground. "My arm," Razor shouted in surprise and pain. "I can't feel my arm." "It's temporary," James explained calmly. "Just like the lesson I'm teaching you." The sound of sirens began to echo through the canyon. More park rangers were arriving at the top of the trail, and police cars could be heard in the parking lot. The bikers looked at each other uncertainly, their confidence broken. James stood ready, his breathing still calm and controlled. He hadn't even broken a sweat. The morning sun caught the mist from the waterfall, creating a rainbow behind him as he faced down the 5 shaken bikers. He knew the fight wasn't quite finished. Wounded pride could be more dangerous than any weapon, but he had shown them just a fraction of what a properly trained soldier could do. The sound of sirens seemed to drive Razor into a frenzy. Despite his numb arm, he charged at James like a wounded animal, his massive body moving with desperate speed. Behind him, the other bikers spread out again, looking for any opening they could find. "You're not leaving here without a fight," Razor screamed, throwing his entire body weight forward. James's mind was crystal clear, every movement around him seeming to happen in slow motion. He could hear his old Special Forces instructor's voice in his head. "Control the fight, control the space, control yourself." His eyes took in everything, the positions of all 5 attackers, the worried faces of the park rangers, the growing crowd of onlookers with their phones recording the scene. The young biker with the wooden railing piece attacked first, swinging wildly from behind. James stepped aside smoothly, catching the wooden piece mid-swing. With a quick twist of his wrist, he pulled the makeshift weapon free and tossed it over the observation area railing, sending it tumbling toward the water below. "Stop this now," James warned them one last time. "You can still walk away." Red Bandana had found another knife, this one smaller but just as sharp. He rushed forward, slashing in quick, desperate arcs. James recognized the pattern. It was street fighting, dangerous but predictable. He waited for the 4th slash, then moved inside the biker's guard. James's hand shot out, striking specific pressure points on Red Bandana's forearm. The knife dropped from suddenly nerveless fingers. Before the biker could react, James had him in a control hold, using minimal force to keep him immobile. The boxer tried to take advantage of this moment, coming in fast with his brass knuckles. But James had trained with Olympic-level fighters during his military career. He pushed Red Bandana into the boxer's path while simultaneously sweeping the boxer's legs. Both men went down hard, tangling with each other as they fell. "Watch out," one of the park rangers shouted. The 5th biker had grabbed a large rock and was rushing toward James from behind. Without even turning around, James dropped and rolled backward. The biker's momentum carried him forward, the rock swinging through empty air. James came up behind him, his hands finding precise points on the man's shoulder and neck. The biker froze, his muscles locked in place by the pressure point technique. "I can't move," the biker said in panic. "What did you do to me?" "Israeli pressure point fighting," James explained calmly. "You'll be fine in about 10 minutes. Razor had recovered enough feeling in his arm to pick up a fallen chain. His face was twisted with rage and humiliation as he swung it in wide, dangerous arcs. "Fight me like a man," he roared. "No more of these fancy tricks." James almost smiled. In his years of training, he'd learned that people who demanded fair fights usually just wanted to use their size and strength to hurt others. True combat wasn't about being fair, it was about being effective and precise. The chain whistled through the air as Razor attacked. James moved like water, flowing around the wild swings. He could hear gasps from the crowd as he demonstrated what years of elite military training looked like in action. Every movement was efficient, every step had purpose. When Razor swung the chain particularly hard, James finally saw his opportunity. He stepped inside the big man's guard, his hands moving in a complex pattern he'd learned from a Korean martial arts master during joint military training. His fingers found 6 different pressure points in less than a second. Razor's eyes went wide as his body suddenly refused to obey his commands. The chain slipped from his grip, clanging loudly on the ground. He tried to move, but his muscles wouldn't respond. "What? What are you?" Razor gasped, fear replacing the rage in his eyes. "Just a soldier who wanted a peaceful morning at the waterfall," James replied quietly. "Someone who tried to give you every chance to walk away." The police had reached the scene now, their weapons drawn but lowered as they took in the bizarre sight. 5 tough bikers were scattered around the observation area, some groaning on the ground, some frozen in place by pressure point holds, and their massive leader standing helplessly still, unable to move a muscle. The police officers moved forward cautiously, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. 4 patrol cars had arrived, and more were coming. The morning sun now fully lit up the waterfall area, showing clearly what had happened. Weapons were scattered across the ground: chains, knives, brass knuckles, and broken pieces of wood. "Sir," one of the officers called out to James, "are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" James shook his head. "I'm fine," he said calmly. "But some of these men might need to be checked out. I tried not to cause any serious injuries, but they may have hurt themselves falling." Razor was still frozen in place, his massive body held immobile by the pressure point technique. The fear in his eyes had turned to panic as he realized he still couldn't move. "What did you do to me?" he asked again, his voice shaking. "Make it stop." "The effects will wear off in a few minutes," James explained. "Just like I told your friend. It's a temporary hold, nothing permanent." He turned to the nearest police officer. "You might want to cuff him before it wears off. It has a switchblade in his boot." The young biker who had talked about his brother was sitting on the ground, holding his shoulder where he had landed hard. He looked up at James with a mix of fear and respect. "My brother," he said quietly, "he told me about guys like you. Special forces. The ones who get the really hard training." James walked over to him, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Your brother served his country," he said kindly. "That's something to be proud of. If he's having trouble, there are people who can help. Places he can go. I can give you some information if you want it." Red Bandana was being handcuffed by another officer. "We didn't know," he said, looking embarrassed. "We thought you were just some regular guy trying to act tough." "A regular guy wouldn't have given you so many chances to walk away," James replied. The effects of his pressure point techniques were starting to wear off, and the bikers who had been frozen were beginning to move again, only to find police officers ready with handcuffs. The elderly park volunteer had returned with more rangers, and he was giving his statement to a police officer. He kept pointing at James and saying, "He saved me. Those men were going to hurt me, and he stepped in to help." Tourists had gathered at a safe distance, many of them recording videos with their phones. James could hear them talking excitedly about what they had seen. "Did you see how he moved? It was like something from a movie. I can't believe one guy took down 5 bikers." The boxer, now in handcuffs, looked at James with curiosity. "Where did you learn to fight like that? I've never seen anything like it." "Special Forces training includes combat techniques from around the world," James explained. "Korean pressure points, Israeli hand-to-hand combat, Japanese joint locks, Filipino knife defense. We learn what works and how to use it to end fights quickly without causing permanent harm." Razor had finally regained movement in his body, only to find himself quickly handcuffed by 2 officers. His face was red with shame as he looked at James. "We've fought lots of people," he admitted. "Ex-military guys, martial artists, boxers. Nobody ever beat us like this. Nobody ever made us look so helpless." "That's because I wasn't fighting," James said. "I was controlling the situation. There's a difference." He turned to the police officers. "These men have weapons in their motorcycle saddlebags too, and I think the park rangers will want to press charges for vandalism." One of the officers nodded, clearly impressed. "We'll handle it from here, sir. Would you be willing to come to the station to give a statement?" James looked at the waterfall, its peaceful mist still creating rainbows in the morning sun. This wasn't how he had planned to spend his morning, but maybe it had been necessary. Sometimes peace had to be defended, whether in a war zone or at a beautiful waterfall in a state park. 2 hours later, James sat in the small office of Silver Falls Park's head ranger, finishing up his statement. The police had already taken the bikers to the station, and park employees were cleaning up the mess from the fight. News of what happened had spread quickly, and reporters were gathering in the parking lot. "Mr. Cooper," the head ranger said, looking at him with respect, "we can't thank you enough. That situation could have gone very badly if you hadn't been there. Those men have been causing trouble at parks all across the state." James nodded quietly. On the desk in front of him was a pile of papers. Witness statements from tourists who had recorded the fight on their phones, the elderly volunteer's account of what happened, and reports from the other rangers. Some of the videos had already been posted online and were getting thousands of views. "We'd like to offer you a reward," The ranger continued. The Park Service has a fund for people who help protect our natural spaces. No reward needed, James said firmly. Just make sure those men are banned from the park. People should be able to enjoy this place in peace. He looked out the office window at the waterfall, still flowing beautifully in the late morning sun. A young police officer knocked on the office door. "Excuse me," she said, "but I thought you should know. We found more weapons in those motorcycles, brass knuckles, knives, even a couple of illegal guns. These guys were serious trouble, and we discovered that their leader, Razor, is wanted in 2 other states." James wasn't surprised. He had recognized the signs of serious criminals during the fight: their willingness to use weapons, their lack of concern for others, their practiced coordination as a group. They weren't just weekend troublemakers. The elderly volunteer appeared at the door next. His green vest was still dirty from when Razor had grabbed him, but he stood straight and proud. "Young man," he said to James, "I volunteered at this park for 15 years. Never saw anything like what you did today. You protected not just me, but this whole place." James stood up and shook the old man's hand. "You were brave too," he said. "Standing up to them like that, trying to protect the park, that takes real courage." More people were gathering outside the office, park visitors who wanted to thank James, reporters hoping for interviews, even a few veterans who had heard about the incident and came to show support. But James didn't want attention. He had learned in special forces that the quietest soldiers were often the most effective. "Is there a back way out?" he asked the head ranger. "I'd rather avoid the crowd." The ranger smiled knowingly and led James through a service door. They walked along a maintenance path that curved behind the visitor center, eventually coming out near James's parking spot. His old blue Toyota truck sat alone, somehow untouched during all the excitement. "You know," the ranger said, "we could use someone like you on our park police force. If you're interested in a job, I could make some calls." James thought about it for a moment. He had been looking for purpose since leaving the military, and protecting a place of natural beauty had its appeal. But he knew he wasn't ready yet. He still had his own healing to do. "Thank you," he said, "but I think I'll just keep coming here in the mornings, if that's okay. The sound of the waterfall, it helps." The ranger nodded understandingly. "You'll always be welcome here, Mr. Cooper. You've shown what it really means to defend something worth protecting." As James drove home, he felt different. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he had used his training not for war, but for peace. He had protected innocent people and a beautiful place without causing serious harm to anyone. His therapist had told him he needed to find a way to make his military experience mean something in civilian life. Maybe this morning had been a start. The next day, James returned to his spot by the waterfall. The morning was quiet, the air was clean, and the water fell in its endless, peaceful rhythm. This time, when he sat down to meditate, he found that the memories of war seemed just a little farther away, replaced by the satisfaction of having used his skills to protect rather than destroy. The waterfall had become more than just a place of peace. It was now a place of healing.